a lot to do with some issues that are very relevant to us in the Bahamas and in the Caribbean. Issues around, for an example, violence, gender-based violence, violence against women and girls, and access to justice, and the perception of marital rape and the perception of violence against women. And I had the privilege, and many of you may have heard the story already, but I would repeat it because I think it's warranted here. I had the privilege of traveling with the Special Rapporteur, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women to the Caribbean a couple of years ago. And we visited, I think it was we visited Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Dominica, and then I did a follow-up in the Bahamas. So we assessed 5 countries. And what was clear for us was how normal violence against women is, and how the ease with which we accept it as normal. And so that should not be. And we should be fighting back and pushing back and saying this is not normal. And so we should try to also think about the standards set out on the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Of course, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is relevant because we see the challenge. We know that women make up a significant portion of the informal economy. They make up a significant portion of, or in significant numbers, they certainly tend to do more of the at-home work and the care roles, the non-paid roles, on top of, in the Caribbean, oftentimes being heads of households. So we need to think about economic, social, and cultural rights as well. And rights in addition to the Sustainable Development Goals, because rights hold countries accountable. And I think our policies, our gender policy, should be grounded in rights. And so I think when we think also about the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we think about women in the workplace. So we need to be looking simultaneously at the International Labour Organizations and their core conventions around equality in the workplace, around harassment in the workplace, around the rights of children in the workplace. So those are some of the key issues you should be thinking about in terms of international standards as we work. And I would venture to say that, I mean, that's of course not all of them, but those are the broad ones that I'm thinking about, and ones that we've certainly as a country signed on to. But an issue that is really important to us is climate change. So we ought to be looking at those conventions and the agreements and the extent to which women and men are dealt with, have the same rights or have the same opportunities and the same access as provided in those conventions, with return in terms of response, in terms of how did we do in terms of following up on Dorian? How did we do in response to Dorian? How did we do in Dorian? You know, in terms of women and men, do we keep adequate records on that? And that's another question. We're going to get to the data issue a little bit later on. So those are the international framework conventions that I think we ought to be keeping in mind as we think about a gender policy. We should be thinking about, as I said, it should be anchored in human rights, and that's really the Beijing Platform for Action of 1995 that championed this notion that women were entitled to the full enjoyment of their rights alongside men, and that these should be included in prevention documents. And in my view, a gender policy is really around, not exclusively, but it's a lot about prevention. It's a lot about response to inequalities in society. And the Beijing Convention, the Beijing, Platform for Action, identified a key strategy for changing social norms. So in addition to the conventions and status, they talked about what can we use to change, or how do we go about changing social norms. And I had a question put to me the other day on this. Should we be focusing our attention on norms or on culture? And I think we have to be doing both, because we have to ensure that our laws and policies are at the international standard, that they're on point, that these laws themselves are not discriminatory, and that our policies bring these issues together, but also that our culture, our cultural norms are, how are they fitting into it, and how are we addressing it? What are we doing to ensure that there is a changing or shifting in hearts and minds as to how we think about men and women in society in those relationships, how we think about the role of women as leaders, how we think about the role of women in public spaces, because I think we have a certain, and in private spaces, we have a certain perception of women that in private spaces that oftentimes goes out into public spaces, and so there's this dichotomy. But I think that there is a challenge that we need to be addressing both the public and private sphere. We need to be addressing the cultural aspects of this, and these are quite tough discussions and tough changes to be made, because you're talking about people's core values. Yes, people don't just come up with things. I don't like this because of whatever. Normally, it's something that they would have grown up with, would have been taught from childhood, some perceptions that they may have had, maybe linked to their religion, their fundamental beliefs. And so to dismantle those and to try to change those, to bring about a change in social norms in society, is quite a bit of work. But that is one of the roles of the gender policy. It has to be about that. It cannot only be about norms and policies and norms, norms and policies and legislation sorry, it should not be only about legislation and policy, but it has to include norms, those social norms that I think drive us as a people, and what they actually mean. I think people voted with their conscious of their social norms and beliefs in the last referendum on gender equality. And I think people were saying, they said no to it in terms of having gender equality, changing the constitution and changing laws as it relate to gender equality and equality based on sex in the Bahamas in terms of nationality laws and so forth. There was a resounding no, I think 80% no. And I think it went really deep, and people went with what they felt comfortable. And I don't know that there was a deep enough understanding of what we were talking about. So I think the focus at this point has to be even more so at addressing those social norms, at addressing those deep rooted beliefs that we as people have in terms of what women ought to be, or how they ought to behave, or where they ought to serve or not serve. So there's some work there. And I think that it has to be hand in hand with anything we do on the legislative level. A lot of conversation in the media right now is on the law and the need to change the law. And I fundamentally believe that, but I want to go one step further and say the law alone will not bring about the change that we need. That's what I say. So we have to focus really significantly on what are we going to do to change, to address the cultural and social norms that impede our growth and development toward the rights of women in the country and equality between men and women, boys and girls. So for me, the Beijing Platform for Action is a visionary agenda for empowering women. It was a reference framework, and it really sort of laid the groundwork, and it got us moving in the human rights direction. Because we recall that Hillary Clinton said women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. And that's it. And so we want to see those principles come forward and those human rights standards clearly centered on your gender policy. And if they are missing, something is clearly missing from the document. So that is what I would say the gender policy should look like. I think that the aim is to take us closer toward a more just society, more equity in our society, less discrimination in our society, less exclusion, and more participation from all corners, and involving men and women, boys and girls on an equal footing. So before I get into the gender policy that we have before us, if you don't mind, Lauren, I will ask participants if they want to jump in, if they have anything to add at this moment, or should we just move forward? If you have any burning issues about that, my thoughts around that introduction, I'm happy to hear your initial thoughts. Okay. I see no, are there some comments in the chat yet? But I see no hands, so we'll move on. So for the gender policy in the Bahamas, as I mentioned or I alluded to earlier on, the policy, and it's shared, the link is shared in the, I think Alicia shared it earlier on. And she shared quite a number of documents, which I think is very useful, the Beijing platform. I think that's important for us to look at, the Sustainable Development Goals, and a few others. But one of the things I asked is that we can have just look maybe briefly. This document, I know it's out there, but the draft is out there, but I don't know that it's how widely circulated it is, but I will go through anyway and share with you my thoughts. As I mentioned, I was here in 2011 when I saw the first draft. So we've been working on this for a very long time. And my initial thoughts on the first draft was that we didn't have enough of a policy. It was very descriptive of what the reality was. And they did a good job of describing what was happening between men and women in society. But what was missing in my mind was action. And I said that early on. That's, to me, what it's really all about, action. And so I want to commend the colleagues that have worked on this draft, this most recent draft, and they had a gender equality policy task force that worked on this draft and did some significant work since then. One of the things I had said in 2011 is that it definitely was not ready to go to cabinet and not ready to go to parliament for sure, but there have been some significant moves, I think. And I think it's very close to that right now. The challenge is the longer we sit on it, the more work we have to do to update it, because now the data, this one I think dates back to 2018. And some of the data in it, I noticed about 2010. So the longer you sit on it, the more you have to keep working to update it. And so, we need to make a decision, I think, once we have it, we need to act. We need to put a clear timeline on when we want to act, when we want to implement. At this stage, I think the position has to be that we need to update, because it's been sitting for quite a while. Since 2018, we're now 2022. We perhaps need to look at it again before we move it forward. A lot has changed, with Dorian and with COVID. And I think we have to keep those in mind. We need to think about the extent to which COVID has impacted women, the lives of women, particularly on an issue that is very prevalent in our own region. That's violence against women. The Caribbean has some of the highest numbers of violence against women, particularly rape, in the world. I think about 3 Caribbean countries rank in the top 10 in the world for rape and violence against women. And that is not where we want to be. The Bahamas is one of those three, by the way. And I think we may be the highest number in the region, if that hasn't changed recently. But we should be thinking about the extent to which COVID-19 impacted women even further with respect to domestic violence and violence against women generally, violence generally. And I say that because all of a sudden, people were locked down, often with their abusers. All of a sudden, people didn't have the space to go out to work, to go out to school, to go out away from, to separate from the tensions that are sometimes very real in the family. And I think was perhaps further exacerbated by the fact that many people lost their jobs or they were not employed. Many people who were taking care of their families, be it perhaps in a limited way sometimes in terms of funds and so forth, but they were taking care of their families, suddenly found that they could not take care of their families. Many of them were hotel workers, or self-employed persons, or from the informal market, straw basket vendors and others, suddenly could not take care of their families. Jet ski operators, people in the tourism industry, you think about it, what happened to these people? And suddenly you're in this space, sometimes very tight space for all the members of the family to be together. And what was the impact on women and children? Right? We think about, so we know that, and I read some time ago that UN Women had written that domestic violence and violence against women is a pandemic in itself. It's really attacked women in a way that is unbelievable for many of us, and we've seen it played out on the streets in the Bahamas, where we've had, and in my mind, the violence was always there, but it became very public. We've had in the last couple of months, women being killed, children being killed, and in domestic violence situations, and the anger, women suddenly being attacked on the streets. And that's why I said, when we think about it, we have to think not only about domestic, because people are attacked. I think a woman was attacked because she bumped into somebody's car and the men in the car came on and beat her up. So this is the kind of violence that we have, and the tensions that are so high, because I think we've been locked down and we've been stressed and so forth and so on. So we have to take a greater look, and I would want to see how COVID has impacted, or what has been the results, how the extent to which it has increased the incidence of violence and in the Bahamas. And I don't know, I'm not familiar with those statistics yet. I don't think they're available yet, but that is something I think we ought to be looking at. Similarly with Dorian, and I my heart goes out to those persons in Grand Bahama and Abaco, because they had a double whammy, to lose everything and suddenly be with living with extended family members is very vulnerable for some people. They put them in a very vulnerable situation. So you think about young girls, for an example, suddenly in a new environment with other people living outside of their close-knit family or their immediate family, in other communities, having to be familiar with that, and what that means in terms of their own safety, what that means in terms of their own confidence and reassurance. And right after that, they're suddenly out of school because of COVID. And so I think that the impact has been tremendous, and we need to think about issues around health and psychosocial and mental health challenges that we would want to see coming out strongly in a revised gender policy. So I think that we've done quite a bit of work, and I started saying that I would like to commend, and it was a really comprehensive group of persons involving civil society, the College of the Bahamas at the time, government, and key players, the the crisis centers and others, the crisis center and others who are involved in this issue. So you had and magistrates and others. So I think we had a very comprehensive group of people looking at this, which is great. And they certainly moved it on to the next level. So for me, here is my broad thinking on what we have before us. I think we have a very sound document that can move forward. I think that there could be some room for updates, particularly with respect to data and new developments. I mentioned two of perhaps the biggest, COVID and Dorian. And but I think that it's time for us to think about moving this policy forward and putting it to the test. Some of the things that jumped out at me, and I'm looking at the document, and perhaps I should pull it up on the screen myself. I have it here. Had to do with, as I mentioned, had to do with about action. So we are clear on what the problems are and identifying the problems. And in fact, I think that in the review of it, we will see that there's quite a bit of repetition, and repetition can be good sometimes, but I think that it makes the document quite heavy. If you look at this is a 79-page document. It's quite heavy. And so we when we review it, we need to think about how can we make it more comprehensive and a little bit more succinct. That, I think, would make it a lot more digestible, because what you don't want to do is have a policy that nobody would read, or have a national strategic policy, a national gender policy. I'm thinking about a strategic plan, but the national gender policy that nobody has read. I think the challenge for us has been, even though we've moved forward and we have a solid document, I've asked a question also with this: who will lead the implementation? That is not clear in my mind. As I read through this, I see where we speak about, we've identified goals, we've identified the strategy, we've identified some key action points, and we've identified the timelines. But I asked myself the question the other night, and I was preparing for this, the goals themselves, and I will highlight the goals. I think the goals, if you can go with me to page 1, are outlined there. And it's around eliminating discriminatory laws, policies, and practices. It's about protecting human rights. It's about addressing gender-based violence. It's about education, gender perspectives in education, which is good. It is about addressing the national economy, particularly the labor market. It's around health, which I think is crucial these days with COVID and other, the strain that COVID has put on the national health system, and the extent to which it may have impeded certain groups of rights. And I'm thinking in particular sexual reproductive health and rights, and access by vulnerable and marginalized groups within society. It's about, and point number 6 is around leadership and government and governance and the involvement of women. And then it's around climate change, environment, and natural disaster. Those are the broad goals. And I guess for me, I went back to the very specific question, the very basic question. Are these goals specific enough? Are these goals what we would call SMART goals? And for me, they're a little bit vague. They're a little bit general. So I can ask the question, are they specific, measurable, attainable, reliable, or realistic, and time-bound? So we have time-bound. We do have that there. But we have the listing. As we go through the document, you will see it. We do have as to when they wish to accomplish it, although the time has, of course, run out for that. They have identified what the goal is, so they've said that. Are they measurable? We talk about and attainable. Who is going to implement? And where are the funds coming from to implement? So those are the questions that came to my mind. I think that much more is needed to ensure that these goals, I think they're a good basis for another round of discussions to dig a little bit deeper on the goals. I know the goals should be broad and encompass a lot, but how do you know when you arrived at, say for an example, protection of human rights, right? How do you know that you have arrived at, you put the policies in place, but how do you know when you have arrived at the point of accomplishing them? And that is what was the question in my mind. We talked, some of the goals are promoting education. So what does that mean? And when would you have promoted enough? And who are you? I mean, is it 1 year? Should it include a particular group that we're promoting to? How would you know would you have promoted enough in 9 years or 10 years? So for me, again, it's the goal is about promoting equitable participation in the economy. And is that the goal, or is it about having that existing? Again, promoting equal participation. So if the goal is to promote, that's easy.
Right.
And I think we're doing a lot of that right now.
Excuse me, Gaynel.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask, I have the 7 goals up here on the screen, and promote seems very aspirational.
Yes.
And eliminate and develop and implement seem very actionable, right?
Yes.
So I wanted to know if we could take a look at goal 1 and maybe just go through it together to see if what has been laid out could actually eliminate these discriminatory laws.
Yes, and I would want to do that. I think that's a good approach for us to do that. I wanted to give that idea about what, so that we have in our minds, what are we talking about? And you're right, you say promote, what does that mean? It's just that we're going to be doing that. It's aspirational. How do you know when you've arrived? How do you know when you've promoted enough? What are you hoping to change specifically? When you talk about eliminating something or implementing something or having arrived at something, or we have a society that is this, that looks like that, then I think those are the kinds of goals we're going for. But let's have a closer look. I think that we have to look a little bit more closely at it. As I said, I think that they've done a lot of work and I commend them. And it's not, for me to sort of to bash it, but I just think that we need to think a little bit more clearly about some of these issues and narrow it down a bit so that we get something more specific and actionable, and so that we get to what we're aiming at, which is equality. And it reaches all levels of society. So when we talk about this promotion, are we going to include all islands? Are we going to include, every person? How are we going to include? Is it going to be, if we talk about promoting it in education, are we doing it at all levels, from kindergarten all the way to tertiary level? Of course, keeping in mind the age and appropriateness, but what are we talking about? And that to me could be a lot clearer. But let's jump. I think that as I mentioned too, one of the things I wanted to talk about is about the issues around data, issues around budgets, issue around targets and indicators. How do we know when we've arrived? And that is what I would want to see a little bit more clearly in this. And the data, as I mentioned earlier, is still a little bit dated, to be honest. And I imagine, for an example, if you're talking about enrollment in University of Bahamas, you can give me something more recent than 2010. As we are in 22. That's a basic data that you should be able to get. And so the extent to which we need to, I think we need to revisit this, to update it, to look at where we are, not to spend a lot of time on this. I think there's a revisit of a small group of persons to update it and get it to where we need to be and move on it. But let's look a little bit closer. And I think language is the real issue here, and understanding what we're hoping to accomplish, and does the language used help us get closer to our goal. So let's move, if we can take it to goal 1, chapter 7. That's where you are. So let's go to the action points at the back. Yeah. So we're talking about, so we have the 3 columns, right? The objectives, the strategies, and the timelines. Those are fairly okay. So the main objective then, objective 1. Well, before we go any further, for those 3, for me, what's missing right away is the who. Who will do this? Is this going to be the Department of Gender? This is going to be the Attorney General's office. Who is going to take the lead in ensuring that these laws are updated, amended, so forth? Is it going to be something that civil society pushes? That to me needs to be a lot clearer in terms of who will do what in this, and who will pay, not just for the development, but there's some cost involved in terms of reforming the law, but also there's some costs involved and time and individuals that may need to be recruited to do the reviews or to update the laws. So who will pay? Whose budget is this coming from? Keeping in mind, if I'm not mistaken, the department has a very, very, very tiny budget. And I don't know that they're the ones that would be doing this type of review, whether they, I don't know that they have the skill sets to do it, or they intended to liaise jointly with legal affairs. If legal affairs will see this as their priority as well, right? Are we trying to mainstream gender so that are we, so that we see what we do collectively as departments and agencies? So for me, that's a big thing that's missing. Who is going to do what? Who's going to lead on what? So let's talk about objective 1, which is create a legal environment that facilitates the elimination of all forms of discrimination, right? So that's the objective, and I think that's a good objective, to create a legal environment. Fine. So amend existing legislation and policies, enact new legislation and policies, and remove all gender-based discriminatory provisions. Not in accordance with the CEDAW recommendations, and the SDGs. I think that if we were to do that, we could be creating an environment that is more conducive to the realization of this objective. I think so. But what steps would that take? Amending existing, and how do we prioritize which laws we want? Again, who's going to be leading this? So we need to be fleshing this out a lot more. I don't know if it's intended to be fleshed out further, but to me, this is the action plan right here, no? The strategy. So I would want to see that fleshed out a lot more. So we have to talk about sequencing. That because then it doesn't really, it leaves it too vague, and it doesn't really push us to accomplish within a time frame. And there we have 9 years to do it. This will start in 2000, we way past that 9 years, and we need to see, we start another 9 years. But who, how do we sequence?
And the 9 years, it seems so arbitrary too, because the Sustainable Development Goals, the hope would be to achieve all of those things by 2030. So if this document is from 2018, 9 years puts us close to 2030. So if it's not actually being implemented earlier, then there's, we're sort of preventing ourselves from even accomplishing those things by 2030.
And I agree with you. And I actually might question whether the SDGs belong here. I mean, in this aspect of it, right? Because the question for me is, are we talking about existing laws? Because right here, this is not really in all forms of discrimination against women. That does not necessarily include the laws, because we know discrimination happens in law and in practice, right? So and I know that that's something that we want to push for in the SDGs. We want to push the implementation of the SDGs, and we want them to be, lined up with our national policies and certainly consistent with international human rights standards. But ought they be in this particular area of the document, or should they be somewhere else? Yeah. So it's just, yeah, exactly. And so we talk about, and thank you for that, Alicia. They're talking here about the recommendation 16 and why. Why would we particularly look at that recommendation? And I would, we can go much further into the body of CEDAW, which is agreed by member states, and not all the recommendations. There are some challenges with some states on the recommendations. They may or may not accept them because they may consider that those are the views of the members, and that's not the views of the states. And the views of the states are in the body of the convention. So I think that we can actually keep it to CEDAW. We don't have to go into naming recommendations and so forth. I mean, those are things that we can consider while we do that review, while we do that assessment, but it doesn't necessarily have to be identified in the strategy. That's what I would say for that. Any other comments in the room? So I think that, the second action point under these objectives, and I'm assuming that these action points are sequenced. I don't know, maybe so. So we have 4 action points under this first objective. It doesn't clearly indicate that anywhere that these are sequenced. But anyway, the second one is to enact comprehensive laws addressing violence against women in keeping with the obligations under CEDAW. And we have to be clear about CEDAW, huh? You have to be clear about CEDAW on this one, because the CEDAW has not specifically mentioned violence against women, the convention itself. Recommendations coming up from the committee and the discussions of the committee have specifically identified violence against women as a violation of human rights, the fundamental human rights of women. States have not all agreed on that. There is a declaration on the elimination of violence against women, and perhaps we need to think about putting that in here as one of the standards that we want to consider, because CEDAW itself has certain standards, but we're not talking about, I mean, the obligations under CEDAW can be quite tricky how we actually interpret that. So I would want to see an inclusion of the declaration of violence against women. And certainly Bellum de Para, that is certainly a convention which we have signed on to, and that can clearly be there. And we can look at other international standards as well that come in here. And I mentioned already the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which deals with those issues around violence and justice and access to justice and so forth. And so I think that covenant would also be usefully mentioned here as well. Again, my view with respect to the SDGs, I think they should be included in the national policy and somewhere along the lines of the strategy, but I don't know if we should lump them with laws because the SDGs are not legally binding. This is the challenge. This is a framework, right? These countries have agreed on too. They have agreed to do this to improve the development of their countries and to show a sustainable approach to development and a comprehensive engagement, participation, leave no one behind, those sort of nice, catchy words. But it is not legally binding on states. Even its reporting is voluntary reporting. And so when you lump it together with obligations, and there's the word here, and keeping the obligations, and then you list that, you confuse, you sort of muddy the water a little bit. So you need to think about that. And that's why I said in use of the language on some of these, we need to be, it's nuanced. And you need a couple of people with a keen eye on these international legal standards and so forth to sort of walk through it. And it's not something that we can do in a morning to go through this entire thing, but I certainly think it is something to point out already where there are these inconsistencies, and maybe we need to be more careful with the use of the language, and perhaps think about how we shift things around. So we talk about the third strategy in meeting the legal and the creation of a legal environment is to initiate public forums to discuss, gather opinions, and arrive at consensus. Now, my question mark as I read that was around arrive at consensus, right? And that is not what you want your public forum. I mean, I imagine this is about awareness raising and a better understanding of what we mean by gender, about gender equality, the difference between gender and sex, those type of basic things. That's what we need to be getting at, and identifying where there are the gaps in the law, identifying vulnerable groups that fall between the cracks. People understand and they appreciate better when you tell them stories. They appreciate it better when you can tell them, this is what happened to my son or daughter that suddenly doesn't have any opportunity to become a national of the Bahamas, even because they happen to, you know, be born out of wedlock too, or be born to a father of another nationality. So those kinds of things people need to understand it. And when people hear the story of individuals, I think it begins to play, it has a different kind of response. But the idea is not to arrive at consensus. And I think this is a challenge if we're thinking of doing that in a public setting. It should be about awareness raising. It should be about gathering of information and opinions. And I would encourage somewhere in here a baseline study on understanding what happened with the resolutions, the two of them, where we are right now, and are thinking across the country, every community, every settlement, what do they think about this issue? We need something to go on. And we need that kind of research, that kind of solid research. I think a baseline study would be, in my mind, the best thing to do at this time. So we're not, you know, just sort of going on what we think happened or going on our own feelings as to what may have happened, but rather we can see and hear the voices of Bahamians and others in this country who had a chance to vote or had an opinion as to why they voted the way they did, and listen to those opinions of people and record them. Basically, that's all we're doing at this time. So we can gather the information. And while we're doing that, explain, promote, understand, educate, if you will, on these issues. So again, I would strike out that whole idea of arriving at consensus. I think it creates something else especially consensus on sex-based discrimination. It's a tough one to look for consensus for in a public setting. So I don't know how close that would, how that action of having the forum or having, I think that the forum could certainly lead to a more an environment that is more aware of these issues and the elimination of discrimination against women. So, and in that case, the awareness, we can assume, might change some hearts and minds. And I'm using this vague language because that's what it is. It will, to me, it's only awareness. And I think over time, you will begin to change hearts and minds on these issues. So the fourth point under the first objective is to build awareness among the citizenry on the criminal nature of marital rape, and with a view to amending the Sexual Offences Act. I think that's very specific, and I like when it's specific, because you know, you can certainly build awareness among the citizenry. You can say, okay, we're going to do this amount of awareness raising workshops. You're going to do this campaigns on the radio, on the TV. We're going to do, you're creating an awareness when you do that. We're going to talk to schools. Well, maybe not schools, but certainly maybe university, not high schools and primary schools, but maybe university. Have those kinds of dialogues as to what students are thinking, because these are your next set of voters, huh? And so you want to have those kinds of discussions with them, and then you want to, it's very concrete. We're talking about criminalizing marital rape. I like it. It's very specific. It's concrete. It's measurable. It's, did we do it? Are we able to do that? To me, that's where we ought to be aiming. The rest of it is very vague, and it could lead ultimately to where we want to go in terms of the environment. But we know that if we have this law in place, this would be one step closer to creating that legal environment, because women now have a legal recourse, right? And they can try to have their grievances heard with some sort of how do you call it? Hope for a positive response or outcome of some kind. So, I mean, we can, and I noticed it's already 11 o'clock, and we can continue to go through this one, or we can have a look at another one if you wish, but this one only has two more objectives, or a few more objectives really. Would you want to continue with this, or just so we walk through, so we get an idea of what we're thinking about? Should we finish this and maybe look at one more before we have a proper discussion? And people, I really would love it if you can jump in. I would love to have your ideas and to
I was thinking maybe Gaynel, we could finish this one and then go to goal number 7, because you talked about climate change and the updates that would need to be made. So I think looking at that one would be good.
That would be useful. Perfect.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting between strategies 3 and 4, again, is the language. In number 4 here, we see that it is treated as a fact that marital rape is criminal, right? So it's like, on the criminal nature of marital rape is what we want to build awareness around. Whereas in strategy 3, there is no clear statement on these practices being discriminatory. It's like trying to get consensus. And I think it's so interesting to see the two of them right after each other, because the language is, and the tone is very different. So like, I feel like if I saw them separately, I wouldn't think that they would be in the same policy.
Exactly. Yeah, at least not in the same section of the policy. At least, they wouldn't be together. You know what I mean? In this policy. I completely agree with you.
And again, the 9 years, like, I'm not understanding where the 9 years is coming from, because if we're taking 9 years to build awareness, then how much longer is it going to take to actually implement
action? Yeah. And that's my point from the very beginning. Action. When are we going to start acting on this? We need to start doing it. And I think that, it's easy for us. And I say this all the time, because, and I was a director, and I have to confess, and I'm truly saddened by it. I was not able to take this policy forward because the leadership had something else in mind. They had different set of priorities. And so I don't know what other directors have felt, and why it hasn't moved, or why it hasn't, gotten to where it needs to be. It baffles me. But one of the concerns I had when I sat in that seat is that we as a department did a lot of event planning and not enough strategic thinking and implementation of policies and that would change the lives of men and women, boys and girls in the communities. That is what we ought to be doing. And this was one of my, I have to say, one of my deepest frustrations while I was there. I put forward lots and lots and lots of recommendations of what we could be doing, including with respect to policy. And they were not really prioritized at that time. And I think it still isn't prioritized. And we keep saying, we have a draft policy, and that's something we say when we go globally, when we go to the UN, and we go to, we're pleased to have a draft policy, but you've had that draft policy for 9 years already. I mean, sorry, more than 10 years, because we started with a draft policy in 2011. right? So when are we going to go beyond saying, oh, we have a draft policy and waving this draft document around and doing nothing to really get it to where it needs to go and to really have it change the lives? Even if we start by implementing one goal, I think we would be well on our way to achieving something in this policy, right? And as I said, once you start to implement, and this has been my experience, you have to jump in the water to learn how to swim. You could read every single swimming book, every one, and you have to actually put this thing to test in order to know where the deficiencies are. And then you begin to say, okay, this isn't working, that isn't working, we need to tweak it. And so, but it has to be rolled out somewhere, some aspect of it. Other than that, we're just going to continuously look for this perfect document, which doesn't exist and it never will. This can be strengthened. I know, I mean, we can do in a couple of weeks, I think 2 weeks really, with a group of people with focused minds and an agenda to do this, can really tighten the language on this and ensure that we have something that we can use and then start implementing, or take it forward to cabinet and do those necessary steps. But I do believe that, we need to see the commitment on all levels as to how we're going to move forward on these issues. Other than that, it's really a challenge. And as I said, I'm not criticizing any of the directors or any of the work that they've done. Me personally, I also wasn't able to implement it or to work on it, even give it time. So that caused me a lot of grief. But let's. I'm hoping that if we can get the powers that be to see the need to update this document concretely and move on it, that already is an accomplishment. Even if we only look at one, as I said, one goal, one aspect. If it's going to be discriminatory laws, let's focus on that and let's try to get that together. And we're going to do that for the next year before we start on something else. But let's continue. I'm hoping very much that we can get some work done here. 1 second. No, sorry. So where are we? So the objective 2, which is to build awareness among all actors in the justice system about rights. It's a big assumption. Rights, obligations under treaty agreements related to gender-based discrimination. We make an assumption that our justices and lawyers do not know anything or do not know sufficient about rights. So I mean, that for me is already about maybe strengthening, if we want, or having a more aware, or having justices, having the use of international human rights standards applied in courts and legal decision-making. That's more concrete. You see what I mean? Rather than building awareness among them, because we assume they have an awareness. I think they do, but I think many of them are quite aware. But they have no obligation to implement it. And so no encouragement for that matter to implement it or even look at it. I think we saw one justice maybe looking at issues around rights and so forth, and that to me is it should be more of a standard. I know that Jamaica has done a little bit more work on it, and what's her name, Tracy Robinson, had done some good work on looking at the use of international human rights standards in the justice sector in Jamaica and around the Caribbean. I think that's useful for us to think about. But it's really about, for me, something concrete would be, if you're looking about the objective, is the use of international human rights standards in justice, in the courts and in legal decision making. That's a concrete thing, right? Rather than awareness raising. And by that, they want to sensitize judges and lawyers and so forth, and including police and so forth and so on. I think that's the only step under that one, right?
Yes.
For me, we need to think about how do we ensure the incorporation of the international human rights standards that we have, conventions and treaties that we have signed. How do we ensure that they're incorporated at national level? that they're used, right? And so when you incorporate them at national level, there's the local law, for example, which I think they attempted with CRC to some extent, but the Convention on the Rights of the Child. When you incorporate them into domestic legislation, then the judges are bound to look at them a little bit more strategically and say, okay, what does that mean and how does that work? And I think South Africa has done quite a good job of what they call domesticating the international human rights standards, bringing them to the national level and using them in cases of, in terms of access to housing, healthcare issues. So there have been big cases on those issues in South Africa where they quoted, and I think the Constitutional Commission was able to push those cases because they actually had the possibility to do so. The international laws that South Africa had signed into had already been accepted and adopted and included in national laws, and so they could use them, right? So that to me is a big step if we're talking about our justice is changing. I mean, they're being changed within the justice system. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think too, like, what is the purpose of sensitizing them?
Because I think a lot of them already know. Don't assume they don't know. They know these things, and they're well read and well traveled, and they know these things. A lot of them have been to UN conferences on these things. I've run into them. Many of them I ran into, like 5 of them when I was at a session in the ILO training in Italy, and I was so pleased to see them. And then exactly we're doing training on gender and the law. So sensitizing them, I think they're quite aware. What we need to do is think about something more concrete that we should be doing to ensure that they can use those international standards.
Right.
In a concrete way.
As representatives of the state, they should be enforcing these things.
Exactly, but if they have no obligation to do so, because it's just international standards and it's not been introduced at the national level. I mean, and I think that successive governments have done that. They've not done a good job of ensuring that we bring the international human rights treaties and conventions that we signed, that we bring them to the national level. So that lawyers and judges and the justice sector as a whole can use them as they deliberate on legal matters. Yeah. So the third objective here in this one is the obligations under treaty agreements related to gender-based violence. Officers in the substance of and procedures related to the obligations of the state in the matters related to gender-based discrimination, gender equality, and international treaties. I don't understand that. Can somebody break that down for me? Because to me, I'm fairly well read on these issues, but I don't see what the objective is. Obligations under treaty agreements related to gender-based discrimination. Am I missing a piece of that objective? Because that's what I have here in my note. Is this the full sentence?
It is the full sentence, I think.
But what then is the objection? It says obligations under treaty agreements related to gender-based. What are we hoping to accomplish? Mm-hmm. Are we hoping to accomplish obligations? Because we have those already. When we ratified
all these treaties, right?
Yeah. So that can't be the objective. We have a lot of we've signed on to, I think, 9 international human rights treaties and conventions, and on top of that, those are the core ones. I think the one we haven't signed is on migration, migrant workers. But we have signed all of the others, and I'm trying to understand. I mean, those create obligations. So, and we've also signed a whole bunch of other treaties and conventions, for example, the ILO conventions that are quite substantive. And I think the Bahamas has been quite active in those. I mean, in terms of those conventions with certainly international human rights obligations, those are clearly in there. And also with respect to the rights of refugees and so forth, there are some, conventions and what we call agreements that we've made with respect to how we will deal with refugees. So the refugee conventions, those we've also signed on to. So I don't know which obligations we're talking about. And this one to me is vague and not at all specific. But if someone has a better idea, if someone on the call who maybe was in those discussions can clarify this for us, that'd be fantastic. But for me, I can't add anything to that because I don't understand what they're trying to get at.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we have the third
The last one.
objective. Yeah.
Provide legal aid services to victims of GBV. And that's quite clear. That's quite clear. Provide legal aid services. So yeah, I think that can be an objective. That could certainly strengthen the what's the main objective of this? Strengthen the environment, legal environment. Mm-hmm. It can certainly strengthen the legal environment. And how I could be honest, I don't know how relevant this is for us and how many persons feel that they need legal aid and they don't get it. They don't get representation when they need to go to court or to have their matters heard. I don't know how real that is. What I would, but it could be, something that we can do. Is not something that's so, outside of the realm. And Camille just said, gosh, why 9 years? I couldn't agree more. That's it's like, why so long, right? I mean, we've had a law faculty here for a little while. I would like to see more legal aid clinics in the law school here, coming out of Eugene DePuch Law School. I think that would be crucial, and that would lead to many persons who would not be able to normally afford legal aid to get some of these basic counseling and advice on what they ought to be doing in terms of their particular legal situation. But that's something I think would also encourage law students and people at the university to think more strategically about human rights issues and on issues around gender and the law. I would love to see more on that here in the Bahamas. And I would add to this, if we're talking about strengthening the legal environment, precisely how do we bring in education, legal education, because we talk about somehow sensitizing the judges, but we need to, I think about the law school and the extent to which, what types of human rights courses do we offer there? Are we looking at anything around gender in the law? That could also be in the Department of Social Sciences, but we need to think about how are we engaging it, and how are we sort of prepping the next generation of leaders in the legal sector to look at these issues and to strategically think about human rights and gender in the law.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here is that the strategy is just a duplication of the objective.
Exactly.
There's no, instead of saying provide, they say implement. And then they just say in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. And that's literally the only two things. So the difference in the in the word.
And again, for me, the question is, and I think it was nicely put by one of the comments, the person's writing comments on this, was like, who will do this? Right? Who will do this? And that's my constant for that particular entire goal. The question is, who's going to do this, right? But yeah, those are my initial thoughts on that. And I don't know if it was useful for us to go through that. I found it quite useful. And I think when you take it step by step, you give it a more of a focused look. And you begin to question, you're focusing on the language. It's really language. And I think I get a sense of what they're trying to say, but when, we have to go by the letter of this, because when this goes to, I don't know, Grand Bahama, Abaco, Inagua, wherever else we want this to be mainstream across the country, to every settlement, will they pick this up and understand what we're talking about? And who will be responsible for telling them what we mean? And who is going to pay for them?
And even in that instance, though, I think the strategy could have been more actionable if they had just said, by establishing these clinics in Inagua, in Grand Bahama,
it has to be more concrete.
It just leaves it up to interpretation in a way that's not helpful.
Exactly. It's too vague. And that's my first thing I write on the front of this thing is this whole thing for me is just too vague. And there are some nuggets in there that are very specific. But you have to go, for policy to work, you have to go much deeper, and that's why I start off with, what is the policy and what should it entail? It has to be about action. Who is going to do it? Where they're going to do it? Where the money's going to come from? What's the time frame? Who is going to evaluate it? All of that has to happen in the policy. So we're clear on roles, because if you give this, if you give this segment now and say, give it to the Attorney General's office, they implement. Are they the right person? I see several different, opportunities for education maybe to come in. I don't know. So we have to think about that. That needs to be a lot clearer. And this needs to be sequenced. What do you want to do first, second, third, that kind of thing, so that you build on your successes. Any other comments?
Yes, so I see Alicia has put some questions in the chat. So people have asked for victim advocates helping to walk them through these processes. Equality Bahamas regularly helps people with reporting and is often a task. Should this chart have indicators? Strategies on this goal are also missing survivor-centered justice and doesn't mention the private sector at all, which needs to be involved.
Yeah, and there's no role, the private sector, there's no role for civil society here either. Is there? Not that I could see. So you're very right. I mean, that's the point, when you say that you're going to do, that's why I thought about clinics, legal clinics, because then they're you put the onus on someone to establish those legal clinics and have those legal clinics that go out to the family islands on a certain day, time, month, whatever it is, for a certain duration. And so that's very clear about who's responsible. And I think that on gender-related issues, the government of the Bahamas has relied heavily on NGOs to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And I think that they could take on more responsibility in terms of implementation of their obligations internationally and in their own constitutions and in their own, policies. They come up with policies and then, we can let the civil society do the work, and I am all for civil society being an active part in this. But, I think that it has to be a shared responsibility. One other thing popped into my mind as we talked about this in terms of who else could or should be involved in this when we're talking about creating that climate of or developing that climate of non-discrimination or laws, non-discriminatory laws, but developing ensuring that we have an environment that it gives us the legal environment that gives us a better hope of achieving gender equality through our laws. Another thing. One other thing that popped into my mind, and I have it here, but I'm just now remembering it, is are we going to, at some point, think about a National Human Rights Institute? Are we going to think about, I know we've talked about the ombudsman on and off for years and it never happened, but are we going to think about that? To me, that would show a big step towards a real commitment to human rights and ensuring that a human rights-based approach is taken, because then you can put a lot of that responsibility on the National Human Rights Institute, and you have to give them their independence. They should be, fully, they should have their full endorsement under the law. They should have their own budget line. They should have their independence to be able to do that. Then we can lean on them heavily as civil society members and say, we would like to see more on this. Here is where we see the problem. And then you have a responsible agency to come back to the people because they will be getting some of the purse of the people, some from the purse of the people if they're in the budget. And they can report directly to Parliament on what they see the issues are. But that requires a certain level of maturity in terms of our human rights development. Are we there yet? I think we could be. Maybe I'm a bit optimistic here, but I think we could be. And if we're not, I think we should be getting ourselves ready to get there. I mean, we're going to be 50 soon, right? And 50 is not a small age to be. Yeah, so you're past the baby ages and stages, so you ought to be doing some solid stuff now. We've been talking about this. I think we signed on to some of these conventions in the 70s, 80s, 90s. We ought to be much further along. Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
Gaynel, so I'm looking at the time. I see that we're at 11:30, so I don't know that we'll be able to get to that goal.
I think so. We may not be able to get into the second one.
Yeah,
but I would love to ask. I mean, I don't know if there'll be another chance. Perhaps, Alicia, we can think about this on for a Women's Wednesday, because I think it's a very important topic to be had, and I want to see this policy moved forward. I am disappointed that, you know, it's taken us 11 years to get to a draft, and that draft is still not agreed. You know, so I want to push this particular issue forward and say, okay, guys, let's move this forward, but we have to really, you know, think about what are the steps that need to be taken for us to really get it to where we want it to be. But I think it should be implemented, and we should be aiming at implementation this year. 2022, no time like the present. I told you, I think this could be reviewed in 2 weeks if you have the right people reviewing it, right? And tightened, and you know, going through a bit of fine-tooth comb, and then bringing it back together to a broader group of persons, perhaps the same group of persons who drafted it, and with a few others, to say, how does this look and how can we move? And then you have another 2-3 weeks of that consultation and amending and changing, and then you move.
Camille has a question. Oh, Alicia just answered Camille's question.
Oh yeah,
about the 3-day forum.
It wasn't about the policy; it was about laws. Yeah, you know, and again, you know, I don't want to. I'm really excited about the fact that we're talking about these issues so much. I think that's fantastic. What I don't want us to do is get caught up in more event planning. Let's have a seminar, invite all the high big people, and you know, and we have a picture taking moment and ZNS and everybody, and it's really nice. And I love that, generally speaking. And I think there's a time and place for that. But I think what we need for this policy to move forward is 2 or 3, maybe 5 max, dedicated people to sit with this for a couple of weeks and to push it out, and then say, here, Mr. Minister, this is what we see as your policy. Please, can you move it? Can you take it to cabinet? And then we get it, just because it's never going to be perfect. And I'm only talking about tightening really round language and updating some really dated stuff, and to get some new information that might be out there and incorporate that in there. That's why I said a couple of people looking at it, taking different parts of it and coming together on it. I think we can do it, and we can have a solid policy, and then we can start thinking strategically about how do we roll this out. And how do we sequence it? Where are we going to? Are we going? And I have no problem with starting us. They had the forum a couple of weeks ago on law, on discriminatory laws. I have no problem with starting with that. We just need to start.
Yeah. There was a question in the chat from Shantez earlier with regards to the who would this be prescribed involvement, or are we anticipating getting buy-in from these actors ahead of developing the strategy? And I think this goes back to your initial question about who is the who, like who are we talking about?
And that's it. I mean, when we think about this, we have to identify the who, and once we identify the who we think they ought to be, then we have to, of course, liaise with them. It can't be us saying, okay, we're not sort of a dictatorship. We have to identify them, though, and then go to them and say, this is what we see, and what are your views on it? Do you think that this is the appropriate thing for you to? I mean, this is something that you would be interested to do. This is something you can take on. This is something you think should be placed in another sector, with another stream of workers. But we have to identify them. When I say we, I mean the person's drafting this. I don't draft this. I don't know. I put myself in this we, but whoever's drafting this and whoever's going to be on the revised document. I mean, we can take it upon ourselves as NGOs and civil society members to redraft it and give it as a gift to the government. I mean, I don't know how open we are about free labor, but this will take some time of your everyday work. So we want to think about that. But I think that we can certainly begin to think about it, have initial discussion with the powers that be, and ask them if this is something that they would want to see move forward, and encourage them to. I don't want to sound like somebody who speaks about money a lot, but yeah, to put some money behind it, because it will need some money to be properly done and finalized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
we have another question. Yeah. From Alicia, and then from Siobhan. So Siobhan's question is why former legislators never fully enacted laws that they signed onto internationally. And then Alicia's question is, could you tell us more about what a National Human Rights Institute is and what we need it for?
Mm-hmm. And so I think thank you for those questions, good questions. I think that they haven't really taken up the mantle on these issues because they haven't been forced to do so. We have been a very accepting society. We haven't pushed on a lot of issues. We haven't pushed. We've allowed our politicians to lead us, and we have not pushed them, and we have not told them how we wish to be led on all issues. This is one of them. I think that, it's not in their interest. It's not going to gain them any points with their voters. They may think, why take up gender equality again when it's failed twice? So why am I going to bring this issue forward? This is not going to give me any points. My constituents are not going to be happy with this discussion. It could be any number of reasons. It could be any number of it. I'm just guessing and throwing things out there. I do not know, but I suspect it's not enough of a priority for them, and it becomes a priority when the voters make it priority. That's what I think. Yeah. A National Human Rights Institute is an independent body set up generally under the Paris Principles. So they have an international legal framing for what a National Human Rights Institute should look like. And it should be set up to look specifically into human rights issues. Could be the development of policies, or the research, and with a view to changing policy or developing policy. So they do a lot of research. They do some legal aid clinics. They do hold the government accountable by looking at laws and policies put forward by the government to see the extent to which they are consistent with international human rights standards, and that they are not further impeding the rights of individuals within society, particularly vulnerable and marginalized groups within society. So the National Human Rights Institution is an independent body. It is not a part of government, but it generally has, for it to really meet the Paris Principles, it should be independent. It should have its own budget. It has its possibility to present its reports annually annually or every other year to the House, right, to the legislators, and to so it gives them a certain amount of flexibility to do a lot in society to move the human rights agenda forward. A lot of countries, particularly Nordic countries, but others, I think they may have even an ombudsman in Jamaica, have set up ombudspersons to look at conflict resolution. So outside of the court system, They can try to resolve their issues through negotiation, mediation, this kind of thing, and so they can do quite a lot, but generally it's around holding space for human rights and ensuring that we have opportunities to strengthen the implementation of human rights within the country, be that the implementation of the legal standards that we have signed on to, and even encouraging us to perhaps sign on to others if that is a need. So I don't know if that is that a little bit clearer for you, or you need some further breakdown of it on National Human Rights Institutes. Awesome. Yes, I think Barbados may have an ombudsman. I heard that we have an ombudsman at UB that looks at conflict or dispute settlement or conflict resolution usually between staff and not staff, faculty and students and so forth. So, I mean, the concept is not a brand new one for us, but we need to think about that. Yeah. Freedom of Information Act, that's also a good one. Access to information. Yeah. So we need to think about those issues and whether we want to move on them and how far we want to go. The government won't act unless the people pushes them to act. Any other questions?
Yeah, any other questions? Siobhan had a comment. We are partially to blame. We don't know what they have signed on to. And many of us don't do research to seek information. We don't apply collective pressure like citizens in other countries.
And I completely agree with that. When I left government, I put together a sort of what I termed a handover note. And I really wanted to target civil society. And Siobhan, I had hoped that you would have gotten it. I told others they could share it. But one of the things I did is try to identify what civil society could be doing and what they ought to be looking out for. I don't know, Alicia, I think you got a copy, Alicia. But it's important that the public be aware. The government has an obligation to make that's a part of the convention. They have an obligation to to make the public aware that they've signed on to this convention and what the terms of the convention are. That's a part of it. And you know, you hear delegations going abroad and so forth, but we don't say to them, hey, you're going to CSW. What did you discuss? What did you agree? That sort of stuff. You just came back from reporting to CEDAW or CRC, but we haven't reported to CRC since I think 2004 or something like that. And we've never reported on disabilities, which I think is really, really bad. And and I think we're overdue by about 7 years for reporting. So nobody's pushing them on these issues. And then you're right, they're not pushing because they do not know. But I think that those of us who do know, it is incumbent upon us to raise the flag and say, hey, what about this or that or the next? And forums like this, I think, help people to get a better understanding of what's required of us as a people. I would love to see more movements in the Bahamas pushing us towards certain things. Yeah, and awareness is a big thing that education is a big thing that we need to have in to help us as we move. We encourage the government to move on issues. But yeah, you're spot on about that. We need to know ourselves as people, and so it's a sort of almost what I call chicken and egg kind of a situation, right? The government is required to tell us, they don't tell us, and we're required to know. So that we don't know, we don't ask. So it's sort of like a chicken and egg. Somebody has to break this cycle here. But yeah.
Alicia says in the chat that the media isn't doing a good job at this. Either they need to monitor government travel, reports to treaty bodies, and the commitments made. Individuals, citizens, total lot of blame. The government should be telling us, and the media should be reporting.
Yes, I think the media could do a lot more on those particular issues, in terms of when we report. what they do is, and when the ministers travel or when the delegations go, they always do a press release. And I think that's nice, but there's always a nice flowery stuffer in there. So we need to ensure that we hold them to a press conference that forces them to really answer some questions. But beyond that, I would also encourage civil society to participate in the reporting process themselves. And then you have a clearer idea of what was said in the room because you were there, right? And so we can, and I say that all the time. Alicia has done it. Donna, who is no longer with us, she's done it. And I think Erin has done it. The few that I know that have done it, who have submitted what we call shadow reports to the committees or to the committee, the CEDAW committee, specifically outlining some of the challenges that we have in the country. If we do not send those shadow reports, the committee will have only what the government says to them and what research officers, which I was in my young days, what research officers find in media and so forth and share with the experts and say, this has happened or that has happened. So being in that room is crucial. I recall being in the room and disrupting several conversations because the members simply did not have it right. And they didn't know because they didn't have any input from civil society. And quite a number of those had to do with small island developing states having no NGOs that would submit a written report to the committee. So the committee is pretty much almost 100% listening to what the government says and or to what the UN has to say about the situation. And I've worked with them for 23 years, and I think they try to be impartial and to not take sides on these issues, but sometimes they are selective in the strength in which they bring an argument. I hope I said that diplomatically.
I would say that you did.
Yes.
I see Camille has a question. So Camille.
Camille's hand is up. Yes.
You're free to unmute.
Okay, thank you. Good morning again. I'm sorry. I really want to go back to the recent 3-day forum because I looked at the agenda and on Friday, the item was specifically on the gender-based violence bill and draft equality policy on a review of that. And then on Saturday, the agenda was on marital rape and intimate partner law reform, and the presenter then was Marian Bethel. The one before the presenter was Dr. Jacinta Higgs. And why I come back to this question is because, okay, so I was very busy. I didn't go. I'm working on a huge assignment in my life, trying to finish that, but I didn't go. But I was happy to get the booklet in my hand, happy to see the discussion publicly. Well, I shouldn't say happy, I should say pleased. I should say a little relieved it was coming back. And now y'all just throw water all over my little bit of flame when y'all say it wasn't so. I mean, why put it in the booklet? Please explain if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean,
this wasn't the focus.
Yeah, I wasn't among the organizers. I attended some of the sessions, but I can tell you that it was in there to be presented, but I do not recall, and perhaps I may have stepped out of the room, I don't know. I do not recall a discussion on the policy. I do not recall a discussion on the policy. I seem to recall a discussion around the strategic plan and the national and the proposal for an authority. And that's what I remember hearing from Dr. Higgs. I could be wrong, and please, excuse me if I am, but I recall hearing that discussion rather than a discussion on this policy and what it entailed, what it included, and so forth and so on. Though, if anyone else was in the room and heard differently, please do remind me.
That is really interesting because when it's big and bold and very prominent. There was like a whole morning attached to that particular item, and then the next morning attached to the other item. And so Okay.
I mean,
All
yeah,
right,
I
here
don't
we
know.
go.
I mean, it probably was their intention to do it. I don't think it was an intention to deceive. I think it was an intention to do it, and somehow it didn't happen. Or maybe the discussion was going in another direction, so that's the direction they decided to go in. But I do not recall a discussion on the
Yes,
policy
thank you.
itself.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
If I may add another comment, we have some very interesting things that are continuing to happen in the Bahamas with regard to this issue. I'm director of counseling at the University of the Bahamas, and we have been in association with the Bahamas Crisis Center coordinating the UB Says No to Gender-Based Violence joint campaign that we had been in meetings since August, and we had about 6 events so far. And on Tuesday, we had 2 events this week, and on Tuesday, there were just some thoughts that were being expressed about the Bahamas not having a gender-based violence issue, but actually we have an intimate partner violence issue, and that, we need to be careful how we frame these issues and all the rest of it. So as you speak, because you have far more experience, Ms. Curry, than me in these things, but as you speak, from a policy point of view, it's very interesting to hear what you have to say about your experience, particularly working with Department of Gender and Family, and how you felt frustrated and all the rest of it. And I could see it playing out even in the community, even if we pay attention to the news, even if we pay attention to the different views that are coming out in the public. I personally do not think that we don't know. I mean, there may be a lot of the Bahamian public who might not know the specifics of the policies, but we know what violence looks like. We know what gender-based violence looks like. We know what equality looks like. We've had a lot of discussion. I am agreeing with you. We've had enough talk. It's been talk, long time. We need to sit and work on it, make it happen. I'm hoping somebody could say, let's just push this through the back door, even if there is a possible back door, because we need to act. So I just wanted to put that comment out there and say thank you so much to Equality Bahamas, and thank you so much for your continued work and teaching and education on this particular issue. Lauren, great with all your links. I copied all of them, but this is a very important issue, and I think it goes back to what you first talked about. Really, it talks about our societal norms. We have too much conflict in the Bahamas on whether we even think we have gender-based violence, whether we even think we have marital rape. And even if we did have marital rape, well, who really cares? Isn't that what you decided to do when you marry somebody? So what I'm saying, to me, a lot of what we're struggling with is what our people believe. We're in a patriarchal society with matrifocal homes, and we have this conflict right from even in the home. And it's all just, as you said, and until we begin to change our attitudes, I don't think we're going to change our laws. But I wish there was some higher force, and maybe that's the UN. I know I preach into the choir, so I'll stop now. But, there has to be something to do to change it. Okay, thanks. Bye.
No, I think you're spot on, Camille. I completely agree with you. One of my biggest concern is around language, and I mentioned that a lot. I'm always at a loss as to whether this could be just a lack of knowing, or whether this is an intentional decision. This is intentional. And I tend to agree with you. I don't think it's a lack of knowing, because you can't be sitting in the same meetings over and repeatedly and not know. I mean, unless there's some sort of a deficiency, but but I think there's a conscious decision to shift the dialogue into something else, to call things what they're not.
I agree.
And to sort of muddy the waters. And I think it's a deliberate intention, because there has been some traction on these issues, and there are some people who know what they're talking about on these issues. And I think if allowed to speak, persons would hear them and would understand the issues and would because it's not in conflict with who we are as a people. It's not in conflict with who we ought to be as a people. I mean, who wants to say that we're people of rapists? I mean, we're not. I mean, you know what I mean? We're not that. But I think we need to call things as they are. I think that we need to call things as they are. We don't want to call certain words. We don't want to use certain words.
We don't.
And I recall one time I wanted to do something bold, and we thought about doing having a viewing of the vagina monologues, and they almost passed out vagina. Oh my God. I'm like, yes, it's a biological term. It's like, you know what I mean? It's like just so that we're not so afraid of this issue. Like people have their body parts and they never have heard them referred to with what they biologically should be called. You know what I mean? And we call them all sorts of things, and we're embarrassed to talk about them when they are just a part of who we are as human beings, of nature. So it's a natural thing. And so for me, when I hear that there is, this is about, conflict in the home and so forth, I disagree. I keep pulling up that thing that, this is the whole, when I say that we are many things as one, remember that, because that's very crucial. That woman that was driving along and had an accident, she bumped her car into somebody else's car, and accidents happen. That's what they call accidents. I mean, it's not intentionals. So they jumped out of the car and they decided to beat a woman on the street, kicking her in the face. That's not an intimate partner, anything. She doesn't know them. They don't live together. And this can happen. And there's verbal abuse attached to it. Maybe not everybody gets kicked in the face, but there's a lot of verbal abuse against women in the street. And not every woman. I asked the question, and I was trying to provoke at one of my family sessions. I said, do you think she would have been kicked in the face if she was a white Bahamian woman? Or if she was a man, a white Bahamian man, or a white tourist, that's why I'm saying we have to look at these issues and look at what we as a people think, and look at the intersections of these. Intersectionality is crucial. We're talking about a Black woman driving alone in her car who has an accident, and two men who are obviously, one of them I understood was an immigration officer, obviously bigger and stronger, decides to beat her up. And then you turn around and say, no, we can't talk about these issues. That's a one-off. We should only talk about, what happens in the home. No, I think that I fundamentally believe that violence is a continuum. It doesn't just happen in the home and stay at the home. But we cannot cherry pick violence. We cannot say, okay, marital rape is fine. You can go ahead and rape your wife. You can do whatever you wish to her because she's yours and you are one, and whatever ridiculousness they say. To me, rape is rape. And when you say that's fine, but you can't do it to someone on the outside. So we can execute people, but we shouldn't, or we can beat children, but we shouldn't and have gang violence. So we ourselves as a country has to come to terms with ending with a zero tolerance for violence and all forms of violence. Right? Agreed. We can't cherry pick on violence and say, I accept that, but not this. Right. Oh yeah, no, maybe he could slap a wife. And I mean, he's not slap his wife or slap his girlfriend, but he shouldn't slap a strange woman in the street. Why? He shouldn't slap anyone.
Right.
And this is a challenge. I get pushback all the time from family members, from parents in school, because I made a decision. I'm not beating my daughter. I don't want that to be her understanding of how to get things right, that you get beaten into submission. And that is something that doesn't fly well. Oh, she needs the beating is what they say to me. Oh, she's rude because you don't beat her. And I think that's an easy thing to go to beat down someone because you're bigger than them, stronger than them, and whatever else. But we have to say no to violence across the board. And then we might have a chance of having a society that is tolerant, non-violent, non-discriminatory, and more of a culture, living more of a culture of rights. But we have to get past this cherry picking on violence, and we have to accept that violence is a continuum. When a child sees violence in the home, they take it out to school. When a woman is beaten up at home, she goes to work and it affects her performance. When a man beats up people at work, they come in at school, at home, they come home and at work and they think they can talk to you anyway because you happen to be a woman. And, so we have to see it. And I want to hear more people. I heard for the first time, I think it was Minister Hannah Martin, say that she doesn't agree with beatings and in school and beating children or punishing them that way. That doesn't mean we don't believe in violence. I mean, in punishment, sorry, but not that form of punishment. And but we have to be clear with this for ourselves before we and other than that, we're going to start calling things what they're not and saying it's not really this and it's that. It's violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really great,
Thank you.
A great way to wrap up this session because we're just at 12 o'clock. But
thank you.
I think that was a really important point to drive home because violence in all forms is unacceptable as a response to agitation or frustration. Like there's so many other ways to resolve conflicts, and sometimes things that are identified as conflicts are not. So thank you for that really important reminder. And thank you for such a great session, Gaynel. Before we go, I just want to plug our event next week, Saturday. So join us on Zoom again at 10 a.m. for a conversation about gender equality in nationality law. We will be joined by Bina Ramanand from Family Frontiers, Amal De Shakira from Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, and Catherine Harrington from the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights. We will be talking about the right to confer citizenship, work that's going on in other countries to advance this, and then the recent success in Malaysia, which has a very similar situation to ours. We will also be continuing to build the Gender Machinery series. So this event and the event next week and the events that have come over the last 2 weeks are part of our Building the Gender Machinery series. And so we're continuing that series into April. So please follow us on social media and join our mailing list so you can stay up to date on our upcoming events. We are Equality242 on Instagram and Twitter, and then facebook.com/equality242 on Facebook. Our email address is equalitybahamas@gmail.com. So you can always email us or message us on any of these channels if you'd like to join the mailing list. Thank you so much, Gaynel. Again, you are a frequent collaborator of ours, and we really appreciate you lending your time and your expertise and your energy to having these kinds of conversations because they're very important, and we just really appreciate your time. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you at next week's session. And again, please follow us on social media so you can stay up to date.
Well done, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy.